Hello, everybody. Our share today is entitled The New Rebbe of Thieves. I recently experienced a lapse back to my former self when I was totally immersed in Hasidism, the romance of Hasidism, and it included a diversion into Shlomo Carlebach, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, and his music and his teachings. I was captivated by those teachings as well. And one day I said to Shlomo Carlebach, I said, I want to be a chassid of you. I want to be your chassid. And he turned around to me with a smile and he said, but I want to be a chassid of you. So I said, no, seriously. So he told me to go to the mikveh just before Shabbos and to read a book called Resisei Laila by Rav Tzadok HaKohen. So I went to mikveh, but I couldn't find a copy of Resisei Laila. And many years passed, and I was always very upset that I didn't have a copy of this book. I just couldn't find it anywhere. And one day someone came up to me and they gave me an unexpected parcel, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. And when I opened it, I saw that it was the well-used personal copy of Shlomo that he carried around with him all the time. Very, very worn, very well used. And I was overwhelmed. Because what happened is, he was at the airport, he bumped into someone who was coming to South Africa. I didn't know who they were, they didn't know who I was. They took the parcel, they traced me, and they gave it to me. And that was years after Shlomo had told me to read Resisei Laila. So I felt as if I had been living in a Hasidic story. I thought I was living in one of his stories that he used to tell. But be that as it may, many years have passed, times have changed, I've changed. My interests and pursuits have moved on. But that little worn book, that little blue worn book, remains one of my prized possessions. I tell you this story because during my lapse last week, I re-listened to one of Shlomo's old stories that he used to tell. A famous story, it's on the blog, there's a link to it. Moshele the Ganef. A story about Moshele, a Jewish thief, who would run to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov would bless him that he would never be able to be caught by the police. And he was never caught by the police. Anyway, the story evolved. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but eventually the thief repents of his evil ways because he had been exposed to the Torah of heaven. And once he had been exposed to the Torah of heaven, according to the story, he could never ever steal again. And he went on to become a famous Rebbe, but we don't know what his name is because nobody wants to remind the people that this great Rebbe, this great founding figure within Hasidic history, started life out as a thief. So for him, the Torah, being exposed to the Torah of heaven, was a transformative process. And the thief, the famous Moshele the thief, was no longer a thief after being exposed to the Torah. Now, today we're going to speak about another Rebbe of Thieves. See, the Baal Shem Tov was the Rebbe of Thieves, meaning that he also accepted thieves, but he would try and transform them. We're going to look at another Rebbe of Thieves, a new Rebbe of Thieves, and I base myself on the research and fieldwork of Professor Sam Schumann. And this Rebbe of Thieves, his name is Reb Shayele of Kerestir in Hungary. His full name is Reb Shayele Steiner. Steiner was his surname. He's born in 1851 and he passes away in 1925. So it's relatively recently. He died 100 years ago. But unlike Carlebach's Rebbe of Thieves, this new Rebbe of Thieves is not confined to Hasidic hagiography, not confined to Hasidic mythology, but he walks among us, as it were. He is still used today. People still turn to him today and look to him as the Rebbe of Thieves. But the story falters here because the ending is not triumphant. In Shlomo Carlebach's story, at least, there's a transformative moment where the thief becomes an honest person. In the Reb Shayele's story, Reb Shayele of Kerestir, the thieves remain thieves and the swindlers remain swindlers, and the Rebbe continues to be the Rebbe. The ending doesn't end in song, as it does with Shlomo Carlebach. It ends leaving us with a feeling of being exposed to a rather disturbing legacy that is ongoing. So now I want to talk for a few moments about the notion of, the Rebbe of Thieves may be compared to the notion of patron saints. You have a Rebbe of all sorts of things. A Rebbe specializes in certain things. I want to make that comparison between identifying certain Rebbes and certain people with certain magic abilities, the power to protect, etc., the power to shield. And let's just look at this idea of patron saints for a moment, because I think that the parallels are important. They're not exact, but they are important. So the notion of semi-divine protectors already existed in Greco-Rome religion. So that's like in Second Temple times, there already was this notion of semi-divine protectors. The earlier Christians built on that notion when Christianity came onto the scene, and they started building graves over, churches over the graves of their martyrs. And with time, especially by the time we got to the Middle Ages, from the 500s on, these saints, these Christian saints, had certain protective powers, and they were associated with certain acts. So, for example, you have St. Christopher becomes the patron saint of travelers. You have Cecilia, Saint Cecilia, who becomes the patron saint of music. St. Anthony becomes the patron saint of lost objects. Now, I mention this not because we're having a share on Christianity, but simply to show that Judaism also developed a parallel way of thinking. We would have to use the word Jewish patron saints in inverted commas because they're not exactly viewed the same way as Christianity views their patron saints. But again, the parallels are rather similar. So, for example, talking about St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost objects, we have Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, who becomes the patron saint, as it were, of lost objects. He becomes the patron saint also, as it were, of bureaucratic hurdles. To this day, if people send things illegally across borders or on airlines, they write the name of Reb Levi Yitzchak, Sarah on the paint on the. I know, Shlomo, I actually shouldn't be speaking like this with righteous indignation because my friend Shmonia, who's on the share today, brought me, would you believe, a cactus from Switzerland. But that's another story. All right. Anyway, that's the notion of a patron saint of
and I didn't use his name. I didn't know. If I knew, I'd
yeah. But either way, I certainly had in mind, and you got through unscathed. So thank you. But then we have perhaps the earliest patron saint, in inverted commas, living at the time when the Christians were developing patron saints, 1st century, 2nd century. We have the second. We have the Tana, Rebbe Meir Baal Nes, very famous Tana, and he also helps recover lost objects. He also protects in times of danger, and we've developed a whole a formulation and a whole ritualization of him and his name. So, for example, you recite Elokad Meir Aneni, may the God of Meir, that's Meir Balanes, answer me. You recite this 3 times, it becomes an invocation or an incantation. Almost a magical incantation, by reciting it three times. Pledging to give tzedakah at the same time. And this is something that's brought down in Shem Tov, for example. So we have these parallels as well. The conversos, the Maranas, the conversos, the Jews who were forced to adopt Christianity during the times of the expulsion from Spain. They adopted Queen Esther as their protective symbol, their patron saint. The Bnei Israel of India used Eliyahu Hanavi. He's the guardian of these Indian Jews. But the strangest Jewish patron saint, again, the Havdil Elef dollars, and in inverted commas, is Reb Shayele of Kerestir, the new Rebbe of Thieves, not Shlomo Kalabach's Rebbe of Thieves, who's the Baal Shem Tov, who transforms the thief, not that Rebbe of Thieves, but a new Rebbe of Thieves, Reb Shayele of Kerestir. Now, Reb Shayele of Kerestir guards businesses, protects businesses, and protects homes from the law. From the law. Not from evil, but from the law. From good. From the law. From the law that's established to protect us. Reb Shayele protects us from those who wish to disobey the law. Now, his story starts out very curiously, because in the origin stories, of which there are 2 that I'm aware of, everything has an origin story. These origin stories are very similar. I'll go through them very briefly. The first origin story is, once Reb Shayele was sitting, say he's a Hasidic Rebbe, he is a Hungarian Rebbe. Remember, the Haredic movement started in Hungary round about that time as well. Hungarian Jews are interesting Jews. While one of his Hasidim comes to Reb Shayele on a Melava Malka on a Motzei Shabbos, on a Saturday night after Shabbos, and he says to his Rebbe that his warehouse, you see, he's a food merchant. He has a huge warehouse full of food that he sends out to various places, to shops and to inns and things. But they've been infested by mice. So he's losing his stock by the minute because the mice are eating his food in his warehouse. And he asked the Rebbe for a bracha that the mice don't eat his stock of food. So Reb Shayele asks him, and this is where this whole story has this undertone that some people would enjoy, some people would say is not particularly flattering for Jews. But be that as it may, the fact is that he asks, or the fact as presented in the story is that he asks, the Reb Shayele asks his Chassid, the priest in your town, does he like Jews? Does he not like Jews? Is he an anti-Semite? Is he not? And the Chassid says, he's an anti-Semite. He doesn't like Jews. So Reb Shayele says, okay, go to your warehouse and tell the mice in my name that they must go rather to the home of the priest. And thus it occurred. And the bracha came through, and the Chassid was able to conduct his business. He no longer had problems with rat infestation, with mice infestation. And the local priest, of course, had to bear the brunt of these infestations. Ever since then, some Jews have believed in the koyach and the ability, the spiritual power of Reb Shayele to ward off mice. So instead of buying rat traps and poison and all sorts of things like that they put around the house, they simply hang his picture up. And by hanging his picture up, you are then guaranteed a rodent-free existence in your domain. All right, so that's the one origin story. And another origin story, and it's probably a similar story. Now, all the Hasidic stories have similar origins, and there's a lot of confusion, but very, very similar story, kind of similar vein. It talks about a Jew who had a pending court case. The Jew was guilty, and there was evidence against him. And the Jew goes to Reb Shayele and says, Reb Shayele, you've got to protect me from the judge. And Reb Shayele says, don't worry, go to court, everything will be okay. So the Jew goes to court, and the clerk of the court comes and says, I'm sorry, sir, but the court case has to be postponed because the evidence has been eaten by rats. So you can see it's a similar story. The rats, the rats and Reb Shayele, in this case, he uses the rats to eat the evidence, and the guilty Jew is not convicted, he's saved, and he's protected by Reb Shayele. So you can already see the kind of strands that are developing in the story. As again, unlike Shlomo Kalabach's Rebbe of Thieves, who is transformed into an honest person through Torah, here the person doing the misdeeds continues doing the misdeeds, but with the sanction and the blessing and the protection of Reb Shayele of Kerestir. And in all these cases, the common denominator is that it is the portrait, the picture, or to continue our theme, the icon of Reb Shayele that works the magic. In other words, in these cases, there's a picture always surfaces. During his lifetime, he had a portrait painted of him, and that picture, copies of that picture, seems to be what activates the magic of the blessing for thieves and swindlers. Now, you could interpret these stories, some of these origin stories, as, sort of saying, oh, shame, the Jews were persecuted and no one listened to them. They had a subaltern voice. That's a word that's used to describe people who have been denied their voice, subaltern voice. And this is the only way that they can fight back. They can fight back against injustices that have been done against them by the anti-Semites of history. You could interpret it like that. But as we shall see, over time, these origin stories and Reb Shayele becoming a well-known Rebbe of Thieves who do not transform into honest people becomes more nefarious as we move closer to our times. And in all the instances, the picture, the portrait of Reb Shayele appears to protect from justice. So, let's speak about Reb Shayele's portrait. Reb Shayele's portrait obviously started out rather benignly. Rebbe's always had the Alter Rebbe his picture painted. There's a whole question of whether it's, we've done that before, whether it's an authoritative representation of him or not. But be that as it may, he also, Reb Shayele, had his picture taken. And that's an interesting picture because he doesn't sit upright in the picture. He slouches. He slouches back, almost like a mafia don. He slouches and his hat faces down. It's a strange position to pose. One doubts whether that was his natural position, but he sits like that and he looks at you The brim of his hat slants down as well. And yeah, there's a whole tradition. Why do you never see him depicted as standing upright and straight? Why do we see him like this, almost like a Shylock figure? Reb Shayele sounds like a Shylock figure. Why does he sit like it? So the answer that's given is that he once got a bracha from the Divrei Chaim. That's Reb Chaim Halberstam. Now, Reb Chaim Halberstam died in 1876. He was born probably about 15 years before that. Reb Shayele was born. So at some stage he got the bracha from the Rebbe of sons. But when he got the bracha, so the story goes, he put his head down, and once he got the bracha, he never wanted to lose the bracha, so he kept his head down. That's the hagiography. That's the story that's told, and that's the explanation for him slouching and sitting like that. But again, associated with him, and particularly with this portrait, is a culture, a sanctioned culture of confrontation with the law. And Reb Shayele has become a symbol of, a de facto symbol of defiance, of absolute defiance and triumph against the law and against justice, against civil authorities, and even against other Hasidic Rebbes who may oppose the Hasidic stance adopted by Reb Shayele and his Hasidim. The Hasidim often have disagreement. There's dynasties and there's infighting, and we know this with some of the great Hasidic movements. I witnessed this myself when I was living in New York at one stage between Satmar and Chabad Hasidim. But Reb Shayele's portrait would be used to protect against the law and also to put other Hasidic Rebbes at a disadvantage, almost to curse other Hasidic Rebbes. So let's look at this contemporary culture of defiance in the name, not of the law, but in the name of Reb Shayele against the law. And so let's start with COVID-19. So during the pandemic, the contemporary movement of followers of Reb Shayele of Kerestir began to grow exponentially. He was always a quiet Rebbe. No one knew about him. Most people have never even heard of him. Many people have never even heard of him, but just particularly after COVID, in fact, in the last decade, but particularly from COVID time, people started using him. But they used him, one might think, to ward off, just like he could ward off rats, you'd think, well, he could ward off the virus, so he's a good segula for protection against the COVID-19 virus. But he wasn't used for that. It was used to ward off the police who were policing gatherings, large gatherings of contagious people. So he's used in a very strange way, in a apotropaic manner. An apotropaic means where you believe that you're able to ward off certain energies by doing things. Apotropaic. So he became this apotropaic symbol. His picture became apotropaic. In other words, his picture became the witch's brew that did the magic. So if you stuck his picture on the door, which is a threshold to where you're having your illegal gathering, the police and the authorities, the health authorities, will not be able to find you. They won't even see the door because his magic will obscure the door and the gathering. So if you're having a chasana and a big wedding during COVID, no one will even know about it as long as you have his picture at the door. And then this became widespread, and the movement of followers of Reb Shayele of Kerestir began to grow. I have a picture on the blog. I'll just try and see if I can show you now, just very, very briefly. I don't know if you can see that. This is a picture of a door of a shul in Antwerp. This was photographed by Schumann himself, visiting Belgium. And it's an illegal shtibel, an illegal Hasidic shtibel. And if you look carefully at the writing on the top, it has a pasuk from Genesis. I think it's 1911. Yes, 1911, which talks about the people of Sodom, and they were smitten by this blindness, by this blinding light, so that they couldn't find the door. Hiku besanverim, and they couldn't find the door. They couldn't find the delit. So we have the picture now put on the delit. So his face, in an apotropaic manner, would emanate a blinding light. So when the police come, they won't be able to see the door where the illegal minyan is taking place. Right? So that just shows how people used him during the COVID pandemic. Now, another case. This is also really a shocking case. There's this famous trial that you may recall, just relatively recently. It was a trial of Malka Leifer, and she was the Australian Israeli citizen who was the principal of a girls' school in Melbourne, and she got sentenced to 18 years in prison for abusing young girls and young women, and she had a court case. It was a terrible story because some of the other institutions closed the ranks and protected, offered some degree of protection, but in the end, she was sentenced to 18 years. She was just found guilty. But, and I'll show you another picture here. If you could see it again, it's on the blog, clearer. This is a picture of her sister sitting right in front of the judge. I don't know if you can see clearly, but she's holding a picture of Reb Shayele of Kerestir, looking defiantly at the judge. So once again, Reb Shayele is going to protect an abuser from the law. It's another instance where we see this apotropaic notion being implemented. If you go around New York City, there are a lot of construction sites. A lot of the followers of Reb Shayele are involved in the construction business, and they don't always necessarily keep to the requirements of the law or the demands of the law. In one case, there's another photograph of the entrance to this building site. It's a synagogue that was built just outside Borough Park. And you can see there's the board. It says hard hat area, etc. All the laws about entering a building site. And there you see a picture of Reb Shayele, once again, to stop the authorities from coming to check on the illegal building practices taking place on that construction site. I'm using these examples to try and show how in contemporary culture, the people, the Amcha, the people are using this notion of Reb Shayele as this Rebbe of protection against the law. Now, the next case is actually a transcript from a police radio on an American highway. So a state trooper pulls over a young Hasidic man who's driving very fast. He's speeding on a highway. And this is the transcript. So, again, many people will look at this and it's very amusing. If you see like a clip of this, it's really funny. And there actually is a link on the blog to X where you can see just a very short video of part of this conversation. You can see the Hasidic guy with his long hairs and he's talking to the state trooper. But what he does is he doesn't speak English. He can speak. He speaks a beautiful English. He's got a wonderful American accent. But he chooses only to use incantations to the state trooper, genuinely believing that by reciting incantations, he's going to escape free. And actually, he does escape free because he doesn't get a ticket. But this is the transcript. The state trooper says, "Can I see your license, sir?" So the young Hasidic guy pulls out his license, but it's not his license. It's a picture of Reb Shayele. So it's part of this culture to carry around the picture. So whenever you need it, you can pull it out. This is the license. And this young man was genuinely believing that the state trooper would not see the picture of Reb Shayele, but he would see a perfectly legal state license plate or license. License. I don't know what they call it in America. But the state trooper says, and he's very polite. He says, "I don't know what this is." The young man says, so he doesn't speak English. "License card, Adam." Okay, good. So the young man says, "Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe." Okay, that's Reb Shayele. Reb Shayele's father's name is Reb Moshe. Not to be confused with Reb Moshe, the kind of in the Shlomo Carlebach story. It's just a coincidence. Anyway, Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe hat gesucht. So he said, oder sich legen, oder sich beigen. Okay, so Shlomo corrects it. It's called a driver's license, and Shlomo should know because he's from Chicago. All right. Anyway, whatever it's called. If he says, Shayele ben Reb Moshe says, oder sich legen, oder sich beigen. Either he actually got the incantation incorrect because incantation is the other way around. It's or sich beigen or sich legen. But anyway, maybe he was a bit nervous. It basically means either bend. So Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe said, okay, either bend or sich beigen or the beigen or the legen. Either bend to my will. In other words, don't read this as a picture, read it as a license, or, don't come onto the site or don't come check our synagogue during COVID. Okay. Either bend to my will or legen, lie down, it's die. Die an unnatural death. This is the witch's brew. This is the curse. And this is something that you can see. This is something that was genuinely believed in. This state trooper was expected to, die on the spot or disappear, poof, into the air. So the state trooper, was still there because he comes back in the transcript and he says, "I'm sorry." Yeah. What did you say? So he says again, Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe gesagt oder sich legen oder sich beigen, and the state trooper says, "What does that mean, sir?" It's very polite. Again, the young man says, Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe, and the state trooper says, "Okay." Yeah, okay. And he says, the bend or die. The state trooper says, "Okay, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." The young man again says, Reb Shayele, he goes on with the incantation. He's reciting this witch's incantation again and again and again. Doesn't speak English. Anyway, the state trooper lets him go without a ticket. And he emerges victorious, boasting then afterwards on X how Reb Shayele had come to protect him from the state trooper, protecting him. I think he crossed the white line as well as speeding. All right, that's it. Okay. Another case over here. This is the case. You might think that the case with the state trooper is amusing. It actually is amusing, but if you really think about it, it's not amusing. It's for me, what's worse than lying, being deceitful and breaking the law. For me, what's worse is understanding how this young man actually believed that it could work, and it did work. But the belief, I know why it worked, not because of magic. It worked because the poor state trooper felt sorry for this guy. Probably thought he's an Amish kind of a guy, can't speak English properly. He probably had such respect for religion. If he'd watch this on X and see how they ridiculed him, I'm sure he'd change his mind next time about having respect for religious people. But be that as it may, yes, it's funny, but it's not that funny. It's used in alarming circumstances, in cases of abuse, as we saw, in cases during COVID, when people can literally die. Hundreds of people could die if you've got hundreds of people at a wedding. There's another origin story. We've done the origin stories about the mice eating evidence and eating the food and sending the food in the warehouse to the priest. But there's another origin story when Reb Shayele starts protecting against the law, because during his lifetime he didn't just protect against mice, he protected against illegal activities from the law. So here's the origin story. So the connection with breaking the law and being protected by the Rebbe's bracha, by thieves being protected by Rebbe's bracha, is related to an origin story during the lifetime of Reb Shayele. So it wasn't just a later development. So in this origin story, a Jew in Hungary owned a tavern. The tavern was open to Jews and non-Jews. Of course, a shikara goy comes into the tavern, and a drunk non-Jew comes into the tavern, and he's very violent, he's very abusive, and he doesn't pay for his drinks. And he does this night after night after night. And the Jewish tavern keeper is very upset because now no one wants to come to his tavern, and worst of all, he's not paying for his drinks. So he goes to the Rebbe of Thieves and says, Rebbe, you've got to give me a bracha. And this is where the formula began. This is the origin story of this incantation. Oder sich legen, oder sich beigen. Or more correctly, oder sich beigen, oder sich legen. Bend or die. Bend to my will or die an unnatural death. Because Reb Shayele then tells him, go to this drunk non-Jew and say to him, oder sich beigen, oder sich legen. Bend or die. Change your ways, listen to me, stop coming here to my tavern, or at least pay for your drinks. Otherwise, you're going to die an unnatural death. Boom. Okay, so that's one origin story, and there's another similar origin story. Again, you can see these origin stories in both cases are very, very similar. There was once a Jew who owned a tavern. So you can see it's a similar story, but he didn't have a license. So the judge of the city wanted to prosecute the tavern owner. But of course, the Jew didn't want to obey the laws. He wanted a shortcut. He just wanted a simple bracha to continue doing what he was doing, selling whatever he was selling. But he just wanted the bracha of the Rebbe. So he goes to Reb Shayele. He says, what am I going to do? The authorities are on me. The judge wants to prosecute me because I'm running an illegal tavern. So Reb Shayele says, well done. He doesn't just say, well, see what the criteria are, and get a license for it and open up your thing. He doesn't say that. He says, bribe the judge. This is Rebbe advising you now to bribe the judge. So the Jew says, I've really tried that. I've really tried to bribe him. He won't accept the bribe. I can't bribe the judge. The judge won't take the money. So Reb Shayele then says, I have a tradition that a goy needs to take money. This is what he says. You have to give money, you have to bribe goy. And if not, then he'll receive a violent death. And this is recorded in Sefer Mei Be'er Yeshayahu. In the other case, he also says, I have a tradition. This is the case of the tavern, and the drunk non-Jew comes and says, I have a tradition. I've got a Kabbalah, that I heard from my Rebbe's. In other words, he's quoting some kind of a tradition, some kind of a tradition, some established tradition that you've got to bribe a non-Jew and you've got to try and bribe the judge. The main thing is that for our purposes, this is where that incantation came from. One of these two stories, they're probably the same story because both have to do with taverns and some form of corruption. All right. So there's other cases as well. There's cases where when Reb Shayele was still alive, he died in 1925, he sent amulets to New York City to some Jews who owned a laundry, Lower East Side laundry. The Jew was having difficulties with a non-Jewish competitor who also owned a laundry, and the non-Jew apparently hired a arsonist to burn down the Jew's store. The Jew had the amulet, and apparently years later they opened up the amulet and it had that formula, or the Bagan or the Lagan written inside this little amulet. Anyway, the Jew took this amulet and put it in his store, and the arsonist burnt down the non-Jewish competitor's store. He confused the two. Oh yeah, that's the story. And once again, Reb Shayele emerges triumphant, protecting against the competitor. Now, as I said, many people have not really heard of Reb Shayele of Kerestir and his followers, his band of followers. And it's not a significant band because once a year on his yahrzeit, which is the 3rd of ER, they go to his burial place in Kerestir in Hungary, and 50,000 people. I mean, this is now on par with like Breslov and going to Uman. This is no small group. No small group of people actually travel. They travel, going to pilgrimage on the anniversary of his death, the 3rd day of ER. They travel to his kever, and they get kvittlich to the Rebbe, and they try and receive some form of protection. And the interesting thing is, it's turned just like Uman as well. It's turned into quite an economic hub, and there's a bit of conflict of interest between the descendants of Reb Shayele in its various faction claims that they own the gathering of these 50,000 people, and the other clans say, no, we are the real family, we own it. So obviously, typically there's these kind of things going on. But what they sell over there is they actually sell a license. They literally sell a license for $15. You can buy a license, a must for every wallet. And it has Reb Shayele's picture over there, and it has the formula or the Bagan or the Lagan. She has a license, keep it in your wallet. If you speed, if you do something wrong, pull this out, just like our story that we told you a moment ago. Pull this out, they actually sell, it's called a Reb Shayele's license. It also reminds me of the Shlomo Kabbalah story about the Mungische passport. The Mungische scribbled something on a passport, and when the Chassid went to the border gate, it looked like it was a passport, and they let him through. Okay, anyway, but this is a Reb Shayele passport. When Donald Trump was running for elections, the first time, 2022, all over the social media, people were saying, and people go to his gravesite, and they were saying, "B'schus," in the merit of Reb Shayele ben Reb Moshe, Donald Trump should become the president. And then they had the slogan, or the Bagan or the Lagan, and they believed that as a result of that, Trump came into power. I mentioned just now the connection. Well, I don't want to say connection, but the similarity between the following of Reb Shayele and Breslov. Breslov has its own interesting sub-factions that also sometimes find themselves a little bit in hot water. We had an experience here in our country as well with one of these people. But anyway, I don't think it's too much of an accident, and I'm not saying anything bad against Breslov. I spent about 20 years in Breslov as well. But you now get a tikkun haklali. Reb Nachman didn't really have anything to do with Kerestir. Reb Nachman passed away before Reb Shayele was born. Passed away in 1810. Shayele was born in 1854. But there's now tikkun haklali you can get with Reb Shayele's picture on it. So this amulet to protect against the law has been adopted by factions within Breslov as well. It is interesting. So just to conclude, let's put on our psychologists and sociologists hats for a moment. Why is it that there is a resurgence in interest in Reb Shayele just in the last decade? There's a resurgence in Breslov, and I'm not equating the two, but when I was in Shiva in Israel and even in Jerusalem, I'd never heard of the word Breslov. I did not know what Breslov was. Okay? Later, it became a movement that's now rivaling Chabad in many ways. But there's certainly a resurgence in Breslov. Someone once said in Reb Nachman's time, I think there were not more than just a very few hundred followers or people who had ever met him. But there's certainly a resurgence in this kind of Hasidism. And one of the reasons that's given, and it's a reason given for interest in Carlebach as well. Why did Carlebach suddenly become sort of like a neo-Hasidic Rebbe almost? So Carlebach was apparently once connected to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He had a different pathway, and they tell the story. I think even heard Shlomo told me that he was having a discussion with the Rebbe that he wanted to really go out and bring people back to Judaism, but he was prepared to go. He was prepared to go as far as he had to go. And then there was a pregnant silence, and apparently the Rebbe looked out the window and didn't say anything, and he looked out the window and didn't say anything, and then they kind of parted ways. I don't know, there's some kind of a story like it. But why is there, in our times, recent times, this resurgence? What's wrong with the traditional Hasidic movements? So, Shimon touches upon this as well, but many other people have discussed this issue also. This is sort of neo-Hasidism, in a sense. Some of them are more connected to more conservative, and even in the Hasidic circles, there's interesting things that the Hasidim have never been interested in before. I mean, one doesn't like to speak about it, but when I was involved in Chabad, we never ever heard of people experimenting with substances. Alcohol was always an issue. Dare I say was always a problem. But today, so many people who are involved in some of these very conservative movements are taking supplements. Hasidus isn't enough. Judaism isn't enough. The need for inspiration is so central that you can take whatever it takes, and I say that quite literally, in order to reach that high. And it's very common practice, even in our circles over here. So what's wrong? What went wrong with Hasidism? What was wrong with that movement? What was wrong with the Baal Shem Tov in the movement? So, it's very interesting. Micha Goodman has a whole discussion on this as well. But lots of people have dealt with it. And the general consensus is that the Baal Shem Tov starts out as a wonderful movement for simple people. The great Rov was always in control of Judaism, and there was like a class hierarchy, a class distinction. And there was a rabbinic class, and if you weren't part of that, you're just amcha, just part of the masses. You didn't have, you had a subaltern voice. No one listened to you. You were a nothing. And the Baal Shem Tov came and elevated the individual, and now the individual got the chashivas that the Rabbonim always had before. He was also someone. And that was great. And the Baal Shem Tov had followers, and they had students, and then the students had students, and then the Hasidic dynasty developed. And the problem was, I actually got an email from a guy who tells me he was involved in the Gera Hasidim, and he was once the Melamed of the Gera Rebbe's children. And anyway, I don't want to go into too many details, but spoke about how all of these movements in Yerushalayim today have factions because now there's a son-in-law involved and there's another son, and the one son wasn't a Rebbe, now he's become a Rebbe. All of a sudden it opens up another base midrash, and now the group is, it's cut down the middle, and then there's another one, now it's cut 3 ways, and next week there's another person comes out, now he's the next Rebbe, he's a brother-in-law, or something, whatever the case is. And the movements get splintered, and you've got all sorts of people becoming Rebbes, or we used to call them Rebelach, sort of semi-Rebbes, and the splintering and the factionalization of the movement has turned the movement into a political movement with fights over numbers of followers, and the competition, who's got a bigger oilam that comes to the Rebbe's Favrengen. It's a rebellion. Very nice, Adam. Adam, you're so smart since you moved away. All right. Anyway, what Reb Shayele offers. He was orphaned at the age of 3. His father died. Moshe's father, Steiner, died when Shaya was 3 years old. So his mother, Hinsha Miriam was her name, raised him to his bar mitzvah, up to his bar mitzvah, and as well for another 10 years. And then she took him off to a distant relative of hers who was the Liska Rav. And the Liska Rav raised him as his own son. But obviously it wasn't his own son. So then when he became a Rebbe, it was a dynasty, well, it wasn't a real dynasty. So Reb Shayele came to represent someone who broke with the dynasty. He was still connected to that purest Baal Shem Tovian Hasidism, as it were, or as they perceive. Same thing with Reb Nachman. The beauty of Reb Nachman is he didn't have his sons and sons didn't become a dynasty of Rebbes. He's still going back. So by following Reb Nachman, you're still in the 1700s. You're still in the early 1800s. You're part of that movement. You're not New York 1959. You're not New York 1980. You're not New York 1994. You're still Mezhibuz. You're still wherever you are in the Ukraine in the 1700s. So there's that need. In fact, some Hasidim are trying to go back to the original Hasidus of the Baal Shem Tov. Some people who've been raised generations following certain Rebbes want to go back to that purest form of Baal Shem Tovian Hasidism, which was what Shlomo Carlebach was, in a sense, trying to bring back as well, I think. But so this may account for some of this interest. He's part of a dynasty, but he's not really a real dynasty. So I said we're going to put on our psychologist hat to try and understand this, but we don't, because one of the Rebbes, Reb Shayele of Natvorna. It's interesting, in our country we have a place called Warner Valley. And for years I used to think Warner Valley is some kind of, I don't know, maybe an English name or an African name or an Afrikaans name. Warner Valley, it's just outside Johannesburg. So the ground was originally owned from people. It was Vorna, from where they came from. Vorna, and Natvorna, is a similar. Anyway, this is Mordechai of Natvorna, Mordechai Natvorna. He explains why Reb Shayele, and he actually explains exactly what we've just explained psychologically. He's already done a Hasidic exegesis. And exegesis has got nothing to do with Jesus. It simply means an exegesis, an explanation, a Hasidic exegesis. And it goes like this. On Shabbos we say Yevkum Purkan Min Shemaya, after we read the Torah, just before Musaf on Shabbos. So in the second Yevkum Purkan Min Shemaya, we say Rav Revaya, Im Zayraya, Tafla Uneshaya. Right? That's what we say. In other words, we talk about Rav Revaya. Now, this is Reb Motchele's interpretation. Rav Revaya, it's a typical Hasidic interpretation, exegesis. It says, Rav Revaya stands for the big Rebbes. See, there's always a hierarchy of Rebbes. You've got real Rebbes, you've got Rebbe. Rav Revaya are the real Rebbes. Obviously, for all Hasidim, their Rebbe is the real Rebbe. some Rebbe even called the Rebbe, full stop, because there's no other Rebbe who can compete. So that's the Rav Revaya. So you get a Rebbe who's a Rav Revaya. Then you get in Zairaya. Zair means a little. So then you get a small Rebbe, like a Hamish Rebbe. Yeah, not as great as the Rebbe, but he's also, he can sort of semi-stand up, like nod your head seriously when he walks, but you don't have to stand up. Right, that's the Zairaya. Then you get Tafla. Then you get another kind of a Rebbe. Maybe he's more like a rabbi. He's like a Tafla. He's like a tab. He's a bar mitzvah boy compared to the Rebbe. Yeah? He's a Tafla. And then you get Unashaya. Now, Unashaya means woman. Nashim. But what there's a tight explanation, like in Yiddish. Unashaya meaning and woman. In Yiddish can mean Unshaya. Unashaya, Unshaya. Unashaya. And then you get Shaya. In other words, Shaya is the lowest of the Rebbes. Just like we were talking. He's not part of the dynasty. He's a woman even. And the worst thing you can be is like a woman Rebbe. So he's Unashaya. He's the woman of the Rebbes. And he's way out of the picture. But in that is the chashivas, because it goes on to touch that the next sentence of the Yakum Purkan goes on to say, Malka da'ama yavarech yason, the king of the world will bless him, will bless who? Actually her, because Shaya is now the woman. So there's a full stop in Yakum Purkan, but he says Shaya, and then Malka da'alma. In other words, God will bless, but God is not God. God is the big Rebbe. The big Rebbes will bless Shaya. It's a complicated exegesis, as you can see, but you can see what the point is. The lowest of the Rebbes, the woman of the Rebbes, will be blessed by the greatest of the Rebbes, so that the woman of the Rebbes, Shaya, Shaya, becomes like the greatest of the Rebbes. And that's the appeal of Shaya. It's like the simple Rebbe without the dynasty. It doesn't come with a package. Unfortunately, that's a beautiful idea. It would be wonderful if it was used not just to protect people from their nefarious activities. So to conclude, I started off by telling you the story of Shalom Kalbach, telling the story of the Rebbe of Thieves. Moshe, every time he steals, he runs to the Rebbe, to the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov is known as the Rebbe of Thieves. He blesses him. You should actually listen to the story. There's a link on the blog. But yeah, from Kalbach. Beautiful, beautiful story. If you're not moved to a kind of half it here, then you don't have a soul. But it's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story. I was moved by the story. I've been listening to it for years and years, but as I say, it took me back to when I was moved by these things. I still sometimes am. Anyway, so he runs to Baal Shem Tov. Then he then decides, okay, he's not going to steal potatoes in Mezhebush, 6 potatoes. He wants to really steal something big because he's got immunity, because his Rebbe is the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe of Thieves. And it was used, not a bad thing that the Baal Shem Tov was even the Rebbe of Thieves. One day he decides he's going to rob the Tsar's carriage or something like that. The Tsar's carriage is coming through Mezhebush, and he does. But now, because he had the chutzpah to steal so much, this was the great heist. Now everybody is after him, and there's wanted posters up everywhere. Everyone's looking for Reb Moshe alive with death. He says, "Oh, now I need to get the bracha from the Baal Shem Tov." It was just after Shavuos. And he runs into the office of the Baal Shem Tov, and the people say, "The Baal Shem Tov, don't you know? Shlomo Kaf, don't you know? The Baal Shem Tov passed away, because he passed away on Shavuos. So there's no longer a Baal Shem Tov in the world." Oi, Moshe doesn't know what to do, so he's crying. And of course, Baal Shem Tov comes to him in a dream and says, "Go to my son, the Ephraim of Sidulkov, my grandson." So my grandson, he's like the next Rebbe. And tell him I sent you, but he won't believe you. So every Friday night I come to my grandson and I teach him Torah, but it's the Torah of Shemaim. It's not the Torah of this world, it's the Torah of Shemaim. I'll tell you the Torah of this week's Torah. You go to the Siddur cover and tell him this word. He'll know that you couldn't have heard it from anyone other than me. And then ask him, he will give you a bracha. So that's exactly what happens. He goes to the Baal Simcha, the grandson, gives him the code. But an interesting thing happens. He never goes back to stealing. After that, he never steals. In other words, in the Kalabachian story, whether it's hagiography or not, doesn't really matter. That's a beautiful story. In that story, Torah becomes transformative. It's the Torah of heaven. Real Torah is transformative. Once you've tasted real Torah, you can't go back to your nefarious deeds. So Shlomo Carlebach's Rebbe of Thieves is a redemptive story. The Torah becomes redemptive. With Reb Shayele of Kerestir, the thieves continue being thieves, and the swindlers continue being swindlers, and they construct buildings, they try to obstruct court cases, and they obstruct the law. And they believe they are victorious. And they boast about their successful activities, smuggling things across borders and doing all sorts of nefarious things, even abuse. And they afforded the protection of Reb Shayele. But unfortunately, in the Shlomo Carlebach story, he ends with a beautiful song. You don't hear echoes of a beautiful song when you tell stories of Reb Shayele, because it's just an invitation for more corruption and for more nefarious deeds. For Reb Shayele, the Torah is not able to be transformative because Shayele's following is mainly from what we would call today the Haredim, or certain aspects of the Haredim and certain brands of the ultra-Orthodox community. Not all of them, but certain strands within that community. They have been exposed to Torah. They've been exposed to Torah for generations. They've been exposed, you might even say, overexposed to Torah. Time and time again, that the Torah has become so normal, so unique. I became a Baal Tshuva when I was 13. Okay? My kids were born, and as the generations move on, more kids come into the world, and there's no, there's not that sense of going into a special space anymore, because you go straight away from nursery school, you're from school now to 2 generations already. Yeah? When I went into a shul, it was an act of rebellion. Yeah? It was exciting. It was something that never been heard of. I was the only person in my town who wore a yarmulke at one stage. Maybe 1 or 2 other people, but certainly where I was living, people had never seen a yarmulke. Literally never seen a yarmulke. To put on a yarmulke was like putting a truck on your head. Everyone just looked at you. But with time, you lose that excitement. And it seems that Reb Shayele's Torah and that Torah that these people are practicing is no longer a transformative Torah like it is in the Kalabachian story. There's no music. There's no mysticism. There's no magic. It's just you're born into that. That's what you do. That's your culture. It's a culture. It's a cultural capital that you've accumulated. It's got no soul. It's cultural capital. You could be living in a jungle following another culture, just like they have for generations. It means absolutely nothing. It's like a language that you speak. It means nothing. There's no excitement. There's no need to change. There's no impetus to change. There's no goal of changing. Morality doesn't really even seem to feature. It's a non-issue. It's cultural capital. That's all it is. It could be anything else. It could be any culture. You may as well be in any culture. There were 2 sociologists. Conclude with a bit of sociology theory, but I find it really interesting. They're discussing the role, and you'll see it relates exactly to what we're talking about. One relates to the Shlomo Carlebach story, Shlomo Carlebach's Rebbe of Thieves. The other one relates to Reb Shayele as the Rebbe of Thieves. So Victor Turner believes ritual. They're discussing the role of ritual in society. Is ritual good for people? They're not discussing from a religious point of view. They're looking at, from a sociological point of view, what does ritual do to people? So according to Victor Turner, according to Victor Turner, ritual is a liminal concept. In other words, liminal comes from the Greek word which means the threshold, doorstep, liminal. It's a doorstep. You're not in, you're not out. It's interesting, a mezuzah is put at a liminal space of a house. It's not inside, it's not outside. You actually don't know where the mezuzah is. It's in a liminal space. But liminal means a threshold. So a threshold is where you move from one space to another space. It's a transformative moment. You're either inside or you're outside, or you're outside and you're going inside. But you're moving into a different domain. You have to pass through a threshold. You don't just suddenly go poof and you're there. You pass through a liminal space. Every change requires you to go through a liminal space. Now, ritual can offer or has the potential of being a liminal space if you wanted to. If you're just doing it and you don't, it's going to have absolutely zero effect on you. But if you want the ritual to work, ritual can work. Because instead of saying, I'm going to stop smoking, right, let's just say, you have to go through a liminal moment where you go, okay, I'm going to put my cigarettes on the shelf. I don't know, you could say anything. I'm going to spray it with blue spray paint. Whatever your ritual is, I don't think the ritual really matters. But when you have a ritual, it's harder to go against it. The ritual becomes an aid to transformation because a ritual is liminal. You can use it. You can say, I'm putting my hand on the mezuzah, okay, I'm going to be good now. Yeah? Or God will protect, or I'm going to keep Torah mitzvahs when I leave the house as well. And I kiss the mezuzah. So you've taken that liminal space. But you have to turn it into, it's not magic. You have to turn it into a magic. A real magic, not a magic. So Victor Turner holds that ritual is good because it has the potential to help people change. People that they put on religious garb, that maybe now that it's easier for them to behave better. They can, if they wanted to, it can. A yarmulke can be a piece of cloth, or it can actually make you change. So that's Viktor Frankl's view of ritual. Then you have Pierre Bourdieu, and his theory in sociology regarding ritual is that it doesn't always have such a positive effect. He disagrees with Turner, and he says that most of the time it kind of backfires. It just becomes routine. So you lose the magic of it. You kiss the mezuzah every time you come to the door, means nothing after a while. First time you put up a mezuzah, I remember as a kid, I put up a mezuzah on my door of my bedroom. In those days, Jews had doors on their mezuzahs on their doors. They were never kosher. They were this small that they'd buy in Israel and then stick it up. But I put one on my door, a big one, slide it in, I put it on. Oh, my room was transformed into a holy room. But seriously, I felt like I was walking to the Beis Hamikdash. A young boy, but I was transformed. But again, it's ritual is a potential. So Bourdieu says it doesn't always work. Turner is more optimistic. So Turner is a Carlebachian thinker. Bourdieu is a Reb Shayele thinker. Once you've got so many people who've been in the system for so long, they no longer, even their great ritual, no longer is able to afford them an opportunity to use that ritual as a transformative moment. Like the Torah of heaven was used as a transformative moment in Shlomo Carlebach, and the end is a beautiful song with Reb Shayele. All the Torah from generations that they've acquired and accumulated. It's a cultural capital. They've just accumulated. They may have been collecting mud for generations. Zero power to transform. And there's no beautiful music at the end, unfortunately, because his portrait and his ideology is used in a religious sense to protect against the moral bastions of civil society. I thank you so much for listening. It was a slightly different share this week, but I think an important share, for me at least. I thank you and look forward to seeing you again next time.